I see familiar faces and new faces to me, which means that I might be a new face to you. My name is Seicho, my Dharma name, and through the wonders of our being together online, um, I'm very happy to be here right now. I moved to California some years ago, so it's been a remarkable joy in the midst of the great challenges of this past year to be able to to participate in so many of the sangha activities, including right now. So that's really terrific. And also, it's an interesting transition time because now that things continue to open up and we're exploring how to be together in person, it's this interesting transition of how the online and the in-person are flowing together, and we don't really know what new relationships are emerging from that. But so as I begin, first of all, I wanted to thank Roshi, um, just right here, uh, for this opportunity to offer something, and to Ryoshin, who guided me in just the inner workings of Zoomville for this time. I realized that as I ponder what life in person now looks like, that it's flowing from how it's been, and even now, there's just this new intimacy that I notice just in my immediate surroundings. How I am with people, um, also with dogs, because this is a very dog friendly neighborhood. And just really noticing all the nuances of people's body language. And it reminds me, just in the ways that we've had to distance and masks and all of that, is that it reminds me sometimes a lot um, of our basic practice, the eyes. So especially during retreat, and how much we really attune to each other's body language, and that in the way that we're expressing ourselves and tuning into each other in our embodiment, that there's a story that's emerging in real time, and we can't really know what it is because we're in it, we're expressing it. And so I'd really like to explore with you today this interplay of embodiment and story and relationship, and why it's so important right now during this particular transition in Sangha life, as narrowly or as broadly as you want to imagine that. And so I want to start that off with a little story from my neighborhood. So, as those who know me well would not be surprised to hear, I do like to wander about on foot. And we moved to this neighborhood in the East Bay Area, California, in the East Bay. Um, I don't know, about, yeah, we moved in January a year ago. So just before, only a couple months before the shelter in place happened. So we weren't very familiar with the neighborhood, but I've become very familiar with the neighborhood since then. And so, you know, you see various things around here. There are a lot of, what emerged during this time were more and more of these so-called free piles, you know, whereas people are spending a lot of time at home, they're really starting to get in touch with, do we really need this? And so they put it out street side, and, you know, this is common all over the place, but I just noticed more of that happening. And so it's really intimate to see what are people discarding, and what am I drawn to pick up or not, that sort of a thing. And also just quirkiness of how people set out. There are a lot of houses here with gardens and so on, and what do people put out there? Stuff like that. Well, one day I was walking around, and what caught my eye from a distance was this big, bright, almost just this massive ball of sparkle. And, you know, I was really drawn to it, but I couldn't figure out what it was. And as I got closer, what I noticed was on the sidewalk beside the curb, from the corner stretching out about 20 feet, maybe a few feet wide, was just this um, was just this fertile looking soil, like someone was going to plant a garden there. But all there was planted there were, every few feet, spaced out and forming two rows, were pinwheels. You know, like kids' pinwheels, the kind that twirl around in a breeze. Except these were covered with, you know, some kind of sparkly material. So between the breeze and the sunshine, it was just all these pinwheels sparkling around, you know. And because I was present in that moment, I didn't have a thought, you know, that said, "Oh, pinwheels. Why are there pinwheels here?" or any of that. It was just this raw moment of amazement. And also, what stays with me is that I had a body sensation relationship to it. I noticed it brought up this joy bubbling up, this kind of of the unexpected, of the creative, the imaginative, even though I didn't have those words in me at the time. And also, uh, there was a little bit of a curiosity, but it was more just this sense of resonating with the rhythm and with the sparkle and the vibrancy, and all of that, that it really just captivated me. And then, as things are, you know, for whatever reason, I was out with my dog. You know, we had places to go. You have to keep going. You keep going. But then a few days, maybe a week or two, I can't remember, later, I returned there, and this time, in the front part of it, maybe a quarter of the patch, um, now all of a sudden had these flowers popping up, and they were succulent flowers, sort of like cactus flowers, low lying and very colorful, all these different colors. And I noticed that in that part of it, there were no pinwheels, but there were pinwheels in the rest of the space. So there was this whole array of bright colors and the sparkles and all this. And again, it was very captivating. Like, where did those come from? And then, as I was standing there, I noticed there was a woman who seemed to be weeding in front of the house. I figured out that's her house. And I just said to her, I love what you've done here. It's just so colorful, and the pinwheels it's just so creative. And she said, "Oh," she said, and I said, they really make me so happy." And she said, "Oh, they're to keep the crows away." And again, another moment. And, you know, I had not imagined it. But then what popped in wasn't so much putting the logical pieces together, but it was, again, I had this body experience of having heard the sounds of crows, and having, in walking around, noticed that there are a lot of crows around, but I hadn't really integrated them in the story of my wanderings or my relationship to the terrain. And so, why am I mentioning all of this? Because it it seems to me that what was happening is that the story of my life kept shifting and including more uh, more stories that I couldn't necessarily say are mine, and yet somehow I'm embodied, I'm located in it, and I'm in relationship. And that's really staying with me now as I also really ponder, um, the difficulties of this kind of a thing that we're facing right now, and have been for probably forever, but in the particularities of this moment around all kinds of challenges. And we don't know what's going to happen. White supremacy and its impact, right there at the top of the list of important things. And so, what's coming up for me is, what does that really mean to embody or to locate in a story? And what's interesting about this is my relationship to that has also changed in that I remember years ago, particularly on retreat, when I would spin in a story that, I would receive encouragement or instruction to drop the story, which was really good medicine for that time, to drop, so to speak, the content and just touch into how it's landing in the body, breathe into that, and so on, and it would shift, and and that was really important then. And as with all medicine, it's contextual. What's appropriate then is not necessarily what's appropriate now. And so one of the pieces that I'm seeing coming in is how all of this also relates to how trauma locates itself in the body. The trauma is not so much a moment in time, but it's an experience, an embodied experience. And so, for instance, there's this continuing conversation about what's appropriate for someone who's dealing with working through trauma in terms of practice, meditation, and so on. So, for instance, um, maybe turning towards dropping the story and turning towards that sensation in a particular way, and I've experienced this, doesn't actually drop off body and mind. What it does is it'll put me into what's called dissociation or freeze response, kind of a lockdown in the embodiment of that trauma story. And so what's important is actually to broaden the awareness in that sense, or maybe to move a little, and so on. And these are the nuances of not always so, of what's appropriate in this case is not necessarily appropriate in that case. And so uh, what I'm seeing is that it's really important to look into what's a teaching that can really allow an entry into this seeming dilemma. So, luckily, there's a koan that speaks to this. So Dogen Zenji, right, our beloved ancestor, he talked about this in a fascicle in the Shobogenzo, or a chapter in there called Kato. And that chapter is sometimes translated as twining vines, is what Kaz Tanahashi translates it as, or I think Shako Kimura does entanglement, or sometimes spiritual entanglement. And the context for that is the relationship between a teacher and a student, and particularly a disciple, and so to speak, transmitting the Dharma, which is a whole conversation in itself. But we could maybe keep it simple and say, as Roshi often encourages us, that this is all about intimacy. And what is that? And so the the imagery, if you will, of if you imagine tangled vines, right, all in there, and you ask yourself, do I see that as a story of a problem that has to be cut through, for instance, get them all, or is there something in how can I be with the entanglement as intimacy itself? And so, uh, given the time that we have, just cutting to the chase, so to speak, basically the koan that he brings in here, it's from a collection of koans that he collected, and he commented on a number of those that he collected. And this was one of them. I think it's loosely entitled Bodhidharma's Skin, Flesh, Bones, and Marrow. And basically, as Bodhidharma, who was the first ancestor in China, as he was realizing that his own time in this life was approaching, its transition, he gathered together his four main disciples, and he asked them this question. And here's the question. He says, "The time has come. Can you express your understanding?" So one of his students says, he gives an answer, just in the interest of time, going to the chase. He gives an answer, and Bodhidharma replies, "You've attained my skin." The next person happens to be a nun. So which adds a whole nother layer here. We don't have time for that. And to her, he responds, "You've attained my flesh." And to the next one, and all these people are saying something to him. So they're engaging language is their way of expressing their understanding. And so the next one says something, and he says, "You have attained my bones." And finally, Huike comes up, and he answered by bowing 3 times, stood up, and returned to where he was. And the ancestor said, "You have attained my marrow." Thus he confirmed Huike as the second ancestor and transmitted to him Dharma and road. Okay? So it can sound like, and some interpret it as this, as, well, the other 3, they kind of got it, but Huike really got down to the depth, to the marrow. But Dogen is saying, no, that's not really an appropriate understanding. All 4 students, he says, had attainment and understanding. Each one's attainment is skin, flesh, bones, and marrow, leaping out of body and mind. Skin, flesh, bones, and marrow, dropping away, body and mind. You should not see or hear the ancestor with a limited understanding of these statements. And he goes on. Basically, the way that's landing with me is that each of us expresses ourselves, and we express ourselves through narrative. And that narrative isn't just words, it's all our senses, whether we make a joyful or not so joyful noise, if we, our body language, all the arts, all these different ways, right? How we live our life. And it continues, and then it connects in some way to someone else and how they're expressing reality, how they're bringing forth a live story. And so if we don't get caught in this one is the right one and that one is the wrong one, what are we left with? We're left with the intimacy of these tangled vines. And so we have the shared need to untangle that, to be in that together. And this is really important, I think, right now, as we're dealing with the difficulties of, the violence in our midst, the hatred, the injustice, could go on and on. And so one of the things that's really amazing that's happening right now is that in our Buddhist Sanghas, uh, we're looking at this in terms of how the Dharma is expressed that connects the personal story, the personal embodiment, as we've been doing here for, so long, to social transformation, to our responsibility to show up in that way. And for that, I just wanted to share one thing, bring this into the home stretch. This is from Zenju Earthlyn Manuel, who wrote this wonderful book called The Way of Tenderness. She's a Zen teacher. Awakening through race, sexuality, and gender. And I really love the way she puts this. And so that's her context. She says, race, sexuality, and gender are said to be illusions without reality, and yet we feel their presence and hear their footsteps like invisible monsters coming at us. But they are no monsters. When we begin to treat race, sexuality, and gender, these locations in life, as much needed paths to awakening, we no longer will fear them as monsters. We're more willing to explore and engage our various embodiments when we understand them to be paths to transformation. If we do not anchor our inquiry into life within the undeniable physical reality in which we live, spiritual awakening will remain far too abstract. The body shapes our spiritual quest. So, how can we do this? I think that one of the ways that's been, really helpful to me, if I can find my location in the story of this talk. Hang on one second. Is the 5 expressions, that Roshi articulated as a framework for us. And I don't need my notes to know those. So, right, to meditate, start right there, and then to study. And we could say that we study with our whole body the embodiment of that story. That's a way of studying the self. And then from there, we act, we express that in ways that bring healing, and we care. Right? And I'm forgetting one. So that will have to be as it is. Where this is very tender for me today is that last week there was a wonderful gathering called May We Gather, which marked the 49th day memorial service for the 6 women of Asian descent who were killed in the shooting in Atlanta in March. And the people who spoke there, who also are of Asian descent, Dharma teachers, they spoke to a set of core Buddhist teachings, and they spun it, they presented it through this lens that social transformation is in the very essence of the Buddhist teaching. And we need to remember that, and we need to remember to reclaim that story, that understanding is our shared path of awakening. And that's very much with me as I, just before sitting down to zazen, scanned the news. And I saw that the prosecutor in Georgia just announced that those killings are going to be prosecuted as hate crimes, and she will be seeking the death penalty for the suspect in that case. And what came to me was the distinction between cutting vines and being in the entanglement of vines. So um, without passing judgment, you know, entering that quandary intimately with not knowing, with those 5 expressions, how can we meet all of that with a heart, with a body of practice? And we do it the way we're doing right now. We show up, we go there, and we see how it lands in the body and what happens when we get up and we meet the next moment, the next person, the next thing intimately. And I think with an intention to be willing to be entangled in remembering that itself is what it means to be intimate. And that really matters. And it changes everything. So thanks so much for showing up here today and for listening to me in my tangled weavings. Because honestly, if you weren't here, I probably wouldn't have studied this as much as I did. But to come together and to explore it together, you know, listening, speaking, it's what it's about.